A family DNA test caught a serial killer who had terrorized California for 40 years. A cigarette thrown away in 1995 finally brought justice to a murdered teenager. The most dangerous man in a quiet Kansas neighborhood turned out to be the guy who organized church events and helped his neighbors. Today we're looking at 5 cold cases that were solved in ways nobody expected. These stories show how the smallest clues can crack the biggest mysteries decades later. If you want to hear more stories like these, go ahead and subscribe. We cover cases that will surprise you, and you don't want to miss what's coming up. The cases you're about to hear changed how police solve crimes. We're talking about investigations that seemed hopeless, killers who thought they had gotten away with murder, and the tiny details that brought them down years later. DNA databases built by people researching their family history. Social media campaigns that gave victims a voice. Evidence that sat in storage for 20 years until technology caught up. Computer files that exposed a killer's biggest mistake. These 5 cases prove that justice can come from anywhere. Our first case starts in California in the 1970s. A serial attacker was about to begin a crime spree that would last for over a decade. Police had no idea that this case would eventually be solved because someone's distant cousin wanted to know more about their family tree. Case number 1. The Golden State Killer. It was June 18, 1976, when the nightmare began. A young couple in Rancho Cordova, California, were sleeping peacefully in their home when a masked man broke in through a sliding glass door. What happened next would haunt California for the next 40 years. The intruder was methodical and terrifying. He had clearly been watching the house for weeks. He knew exactly where to go, what to avoid, and how to control his victims. After the attack, he vanished into the night, leaving behind only fear and a few pieces of physical evidence that seemed useless at the time. But this was just the beginning. Over the next few months, similar attacks started happening across Sacramento County. The pattern was always the same. A masked man would break into homes in the middle of the night. He targeted couples, young women living alone, and families with teenage daughters. He seemed to know their schedules, their habits, even their personal details. The attacks were getting bolder and more frequent. By 1977, he had struck over a dozen times. The media started calling him the East Area Rapist, but people in Sacramento had their own name for him. They called him the Night Stalker, years before that name became famous for another killer. What made this case so terrifying was how prepared the attacker seemed to be. Victims reported that he knew things about them that only someone who had been watching for weeks could know. He knew when they got home from work. He knew which doors they left unlocked. He knew when they would be alone. Police started getting reports from residents who had seen a strange man lurking in their neighborhoods. He would ride a bicycle through suburban streets at odd hours. He would peer over fences and look through windows. When confronted, he would pedal away quickly, disappearing into the maze of suburban streets. Detective Larry Crompton was one of the first investigators assigned to the case. He noticed something that other officers had missed. The attacker wasn't just randomly picking houses. He was choosing specific types of victims in specific types of neighborhoods. He preferred newer suburban developments where the houses were similar and the streets were easy to navigate. The attacks continued through 1977 and 1978, but then something changed. The East Area Rapists started moving south into different counties. The attacks in Sacramento stopped, but similar crimes began happening in Contra Costa County, then in the East Bay area. Police departments in different counties didn't communicate well with each other in the 1970s. It took months before investigators realized they were dealing with the same person. By then, he had attacked dozens more victims and was becoming even more violent. In 1979, the attacks took a deadly turn. The East Area Rapist had moved to Southern California, and now he wasn't just attacking people. He was killing them. The first murders happened in Goleta, a quiet college town near Santa Barbara. A couple was found shot to death in their home, and the crime scene showed all the same signs as the East Area Rapist attacks. More murders followed. The criminals seemed to be escalating, becoming more confident and more dangerous. Police realized they were no longer hunting just a serial rapist. They were hunting a serial killer. The media started calling him different names in different areas. In Southern California, he became known as the original Night Stalker. In some places, he was called the Golden State Killer, a name that would eventually stick for all his crimes across the state. But then, in 1986, after more than a decade of terror, the attacks suddenly stopped. The Golden State Killer simply vanished. There were no more break-ins, no more attacks, no more murders. It was as if he had never existed. Investigators were left with dozens of crime scenes, hundreds of pieces of evidence, and no real leads. They had composite sketches that all looked slightly different. They had witness descriptions that varied from case to case. They had shoe prints, tire tracks, and other physical evidence, but nothing that led to a specific person. Most importantly, they had DNA. Starting in the 1980s, crime labs began testing biological evidence from the scenes. They were able to confirm that all these attacks, from Sacramento to Southern California, were committed by the same person. They had his genetic profile, but it didn't match anyone in the criminal database. For years, investigators would run the DNA profile against new entries in the system, hoping for a match. They tested suspects, persons of interest, anyone who seemed to fit the profile. Nothing worked. The Golden State Killer's DNA wasn't in the system, which suggested he had never been convicted of a serious crime. As the years passed, the case grew cold. The original investigators retired. New technology emerged, but it didn't help much with a case where they knew who they were looking for genetically, but had no idea who that person actually was. Detective Paul Holes became obsessed with the case in the 1990s. He worked for the Contra Costa County Sheriff's Office and had access to evidence from multiple jurisdictions. He spent years studying the crime scenes, the timeline, and the evidence, trying to find patterns that earlier investigators had missed. Holes noticed that the attacker seemed to have detailed knowledge of law enforcement procedures. He avoided leaving fingerprints in places where police typically looked for them. He was careful about DNA evidence, even before most criminals knew what DNA evidence was. This suggested he might have some connection to law enforcement or the military. The case got new attention in the 2010s, when writer Michelle McNamara began investigating it for her blog and later for a book. She was the one who popularized the name Golden State Killer for all the crimes across California. Her research brought new attention to the case and inspired a new generation of amateur detectives to look at the evidence. But the real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Genetic genealogy was becoming popular in the 2010s. Websites like Ancestry.com and 23andMe were allowing people to upload their DNA and find relatives they never knew existed. Millions of people were using these services to learn about their family history. Investigator Paul Holes had an idea. What if they could use these genealogy databases to find the Golden State Killer? They couldn't upload his DNA to commercial sites like Ancestry because of privacy policies, but there was one site that allowed law enforcement uploads. It was called GetMatch, and it was designed for serious genealogy researchers. In 2018, investigators created a fake profile and uploaded the Golden State Killer's DNA to GetMatch. They weren't expecting a direct match, but they hoped to find distant relatives who might lead them to a suspect. The results were better than they had hoped. The DNA matched several people in the database, but they were all distant relatives. Third cousins, fourth cousins, people who shared great-great-grandparents with the killer, but had never met him, and didn't even know he existed. This is where the investigation became like a giant puzzle. Genetic genealogist Barbara Ray Venter was brought in to help build family trees. She started with the distant relatives and worked backwards through generations, trying to find common ancestors. After months of work, they narrowed it down to a few potential suspects. One name kept coming up in their research: Joseph James Dinghello. He was the right age, had lived in the right areas at the right times, and fit the physical description from witnesses. Even better, Dinghello had been a police officer. He worked for the Exeter Police Department in the Central Valley during the early 1970s, then joined the Auburn Police Department near Sacramento in 1976, right when the East Area rapist attacks began. Dinghello had been fired from the Auburn Police Department in 1979 for shoplifting dog repellent from a pharmacy. The timing was significant. The East Area rapist attacks in Northern California had stopped around the same time, and the killings in Southern California had begun shortly after. Investigators realized they needed to be absolutely certain before making an arrest. They decided to get a fresh DNA sample from Dinghello to compare with the evidence. The problem was doing this without alerting him that he was a suspect. On April 18, 2018, investigators followed Dinghello to a hobby store. After he left, they collected items he had touched and discarded. The DNA from those items was a perfect match for the Golden State Killer. Joseph James Dangelo had been hiding in plain sight for 40 years. He had worked as a police officer, then as a mechanic for a grocery store chain until he retired. His neighbors knew him as a quiet man who kept to himself. His family had no idea about his crimes. The most shocking part was how ordinary he seemed. This wasn't the monster that victims and investigators had imagined. This was a grandfather who lived in a normal suburban house and had managed to keep his secret for 4 decades. Dangelo eventually pleaded guilty to 13 murders and numerous other charges. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During his sentencing hearing, several survivors confronted him directly, telling him how his crimes had affected their lives. The Golden State Killer case changed criminal investigations forever. It proved that genetic genealogy could solve cases that seemed impossible. Since 2018, this technique has been used to solve dozens of other cold cases, bringing justice to families who had waited years or even decades for answers. But the most important lesson from this case is that justice can come from the most unexpected places. The Golden State Killer wasn't caught by traditional police work or new forensic technology. He was caught because thousands of people decided to learn about their family history. One of those people happened to be distantly related to a serial killer, and that connection, traced through generations of family trees, finally brought him down. Case 2. The Murder of Crystal Beslanowicz. On March 6, 1995, 17-year-old Crystal Beslanowicz was enjoying what should have been a normal day in Provo, Utah. She was a senior in high school, looking forward to graduation and planning her future. She had no idea that this would be the last day of her life. Crystal had decided to spend the afternoon at Rock Canyon Park, a popular spot near Brigham Young University where students and locals often went to hike, relax, and enjoy the outdoors. The park sits along the Provo River, with trails that wind through beautiful canyon scenery. It was the kind of place where a teenager could go to get away from the pressures of school and life. But something went terribly wrong that day. When Crystal didn't come home that evening, her family immediately knew something was wrong. Crystal was responsible and always let her parents know where she was going. She wouldn't just disappear without calling. Her family contacted the police, and a search began that same night. Volunteers joined law enforcement officers, spreading out through Rock Canyon Park with flashlights and calling her name. The search continued through the next day, with helicopters joining ground teams to cover the rough terrain. On March 8th, 2 days after Crystal had gone missing, searchers found her body near the Provo River. She had been murdered. The crime scene was devastating for everyone involved. Here was a young woman who had her whole life ahead of her, killed in a place that was supposed to be safe and peaceful. Detective Todd Park was assigned to lead the investigation. He had worked homicide cases before, but this one felt different. Crystal was just a kid, and she had been killed for no apparent reason. There was no evidence of robbery, no signs that she knew her attacker, no obvious motive for anyone to hurt her. The crime scene investigation was thorough and careful. Detectives photographed everything, collected every piece of potential evidence, and interviewed anyone who might have seen Crystal that day. They found several items near the scene that didn't seem to belong to Crystal, including a cigarette butt that appeared to have been recently smoked. The cigarette butt was carefully collected and stored as evidence. In 1995, DNA testing was still relatively new and expensive. Police departments had to be selective about which evidence they tested, focusing on items that seemed most likely to yield useful results. At the time, getting DNA from a cigarette butt was difficult and not always successful. Investigators interviewed dozens of people. They talked to Crystal's friends, her classmates, her teachers, and her co-workers at the part-time job she had at a local store. Everyone described her the same way. She was kind, responsible, and well-liked. Nobody could think of anyone who would want to hurt her. Police also canvassed the area around Rock Canyon Park, talking to residents and businesses to see if anyone had seen Crystal or noticed anything unusual that day. They were looking for anyone who might have been in the park around the time of the murder. Any vehicles that seemed out of place, any behavior that struck witnesses as odd. The investigation expanded to include a review of similar crimes in the area. Detectives wanted to know if this might be connected to other attacks or if the killer had struck before. They looked at unsolved cases throughout Utah and neighboring states, searching for patterns that might point them toward a suspect. Weeks turned into months with no solid leads. Police had a few potential suspects, mostly men who had been in the area that day or who had some connection to the park, but none of them panned out. The evidence wasn't pointing to anyone specific, and witnesses hadn't seen anything that helped identify the killer. The case began to go cold. Detective Park continued working other leads when they came in, but new information was becoming rare. The evidence sat in storage, waiting for either a breakthrough in the investigation or advances in technology that might make it more useful. Crystal's family never gave up hope. Her parents, Dan and Kathy Bislanowicz, kept her case in the public eye. They organized memorial events, spoke to local media, and worked with advocacy groups to keep attention on unsolved murders. They believed that someone, somewhere, knew something that could help solve their daughter's case. The years passed slowly. 1996, 1997, 1998. Detective Park retired, and other investigators took over the case file. New detectives would review the evidence periodically, hoping to spot something that earlier investigators had missed, but the case remained unsolved. By 2000, the murder of Crystal Bislanowicz was officially a cold case. The file was stored with hundreds of other unsolved cases, pulled out occasionally when new information came in or when advances in forensic technology offered new possibilities for testing old evidence. DNA technology was improving rapidly during this time. What had been impossible or impractical in 1995 was becoming routine by the early 2000s. Crime labs were developing new techniques for extracting genetic material from smaller and older samples. Evidence that had been considered too degraded to test was suddenly yielding useful results. In 2005, the Utah State Crime Lab decided to take another look at some of their older cases, including Crystal's murder. They retested several pieces of evidence using newer DNA extraction methods, but the results were still inconclusive. The cigarette butt and other potential DNA sources had been exposed to the elements for too long, and the genetic material was too degraded to produce a clear profile. But technology kept advancing. By 2010, crime labs had developed even more sensitive techniques for working with degraded DNA samples. These new methods could sometimes extract useful genetic information from evidence that previous techniques couldn't handle. Detective Ray Darling had taken over the Bislanowicz case by then. He was part of a new generation of investigators who understood how genetic technology could solve old cases. He had seen other cold cases broken open by retesting evidence with newer methods, and he was determined to give Crystal's case every possible chance. In 2013, the Utah State Crime Lab had acquired a new DNA analysis system that was specifically designed to work with degraded and limited samples. Detective Darling requested that all the evidence from Crystal's case be retested using this new technology. The cigarette butt that had been collected 18 years earlier was sent for analysis. This time, the lab technicians were able to extract a partial DNA profile. It wasn't perfect, but it was good enough to run through the national DNA database known as CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System. The CODIS search produced a hit. The DNA from the cigarette butt matched a man named Joseph Michael Simpson. Simpson was in the database because he had been arrested for an unrelated crime in Florida several years earlier. When his DNA was entered into the system, it sat there waiting for a match that nobody expected would ever come. Detective Darling couldn't believe it when he got the call from the lab. After 18 years, they finally had a suspect with a name and a current address. But when he started researching Joseph Michael Simpson, what he found was even more surprising. Simpson had been living in Utah in 1995. In fact, he had been working as a shuttle driver for a resort in the Provo area, driving guests between the airport and various hotels. His job would have taken him all over the region, including areas near Rock Canyon Park. But there was no obvious connection between Simpson and Crystal Bislanowicz. They didn't know each other, didn't move in the same social circles, had never worked together, or attended the same school. It appeared to be a random crime, which explained why investigators had never been able to identify him through traditional detective work. After the murder, Simpson had left Utah and moved to Florida. He had been living there quietly for nearly 2 decades, working various jobs and staying out of trouble for the most part. The arrest that put his DNA in the database was for a minor offense that had nothing to do with violence. Detective Darling worked with Florida authorities to arrest Simpson in 2014. When confronted with the DNA evidence, Simpson eventually confessed to killing Crystal Bislanowicz. He said it had been a random encounter that turned violent, exactly what investigators had suspected all along. The confession brought closure to a case that had haunted the Provo Police Department and Crystal's family for nearly 20 years. But it also highlighted how different the investigation might have been if the same DNA technology had existed in 1995. That cigarette butt had been sitting in evidence storage for 18 years, waiting for science to catch up to the crime. The killer had been living freely in Florida, probably assuming he had gotten away with murder. He had no way of knowing that the cigarette he had casually discarded near a crime scene would eventually betray him. Joseph Michael Simpson was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison for the murder of Crystal Beslanowicz. During his sentencing hearing, Crystal's parents finally got the chance to speak directly to the man who had killed their daughter. They told him about the pain his actions had caused and how his crime had affected not just their family, but the entire community. The case became a perfect example of how persistence and advancing technology can solve even the coldest cases. That cigarette butt seemed like a long shot when it was collected in 1995, but it turned out to be the key piece of evidence that brought justice for Crystal. The lesson from Crystal Beslanowicz's case is simple but powerful. Evidence that seems useless today might be the key to solving a crime tomorrow. Every piece of potential evidence matters, even when current technology can't make use of it. Science keeps advancing, and cases that seem hopeless can suddenly break wide open. For Crystal's family, the arrest and conviction brought a sense of closure they had been seeking for nearly 20 years. They finally knew who had killed their daughter and why. More importantly, they knew that justice had been served, even though it took almost 2 decades to achieve. The murder of Crystal Beslanowicz proves that sometimes the smallest piece of evidence can make the biggest difference. A cigarette butt that took 18 years to yield its secrets eventually brought down a killer who thought he was safe. It's a reminder that in the world of criminal investigation, patience and persistence can be just as important as skill and technology. Case 3. The murder of Christine Jessup. October 3, 1984, started as a normal day for 9-year-old Christine Jessup in Queensville, Ontario. She was in 4th grade, a bright and cheerful little girl who loved school and spending time with her family. Her parents, Bob and Janet Jessup, had no reason to think this day would be any different from countless others. Christine came home from school that afternoon around 3:30, just like she did every day. Her mother Janet was at work, but Christine's older brother Ken was supposed to be home soon. The plan was simple. Christine would wait at home until Ken arrived. Then they would spend the afternoon together until their parents got back from work. But when Ken arrived home around 4 p.m., Christine was nowhere to be found. The house was empty, the front door was unlocked, and there was no sign of where she might have gone. Ken wasn't immediately worried. Sometimes Christine would visit neighbors or friends without leaving a note. But as the minutes turned into hours, concern began to grow. When Bob and Janet Jessup came home that evening and found that Christine was still missing, they immediately called the police. Christine was a responsible child who always let her parents know where she was going. She wouldn't just disappear without telling someone. The search for Christine began that night and continued for days. Police officers, volunteers from the community, and search and rescue teams combed through the rural areas around Queensville. They checked every house, every barn, every possible place where a 9-year-old girl might be hiding or might have been taken. The investigation quickly focused on people who knew the Jessup family. In a small community like Queensville, everyone knew everyone else. Police interviewed neighbors, family friends, teachers, and anyone who had contact with Christine. They were looking for someone who might have had an opportunity to take her and a reason to do so. One name that came up during the interviews was Guy Paul Morin. He was a 23-year-old man who lived next door to the Jessups. Morin was quiet and kept to himself mostly, but he was known to be a little odd by neighborhood standards. He played the clarinet, kept bees as a hobby, and sometimes made comments that people found strange. Morin had been at work on October 3rd, but he lived so close to the Jessup house that investigators felt they needed to look at him more closely. When they interviewed him, they found his behavior suspicious. He seemed nervous, gave answers that didn't always make sense, and appeared to know more about the case than he should have. 3 months later, in January 1985, Christine's body was found in a field about 50 kilometers from her home. The discovery was heartbreaking for her family and the entire community. Christine had been sexually assaulted and murdered. The crime scene investigation yielded some physical evidence, including hair fibers and other materials that could potentially link the killer to the victim. The focus of the investigation intensified on Guy Paul Morin. Police believed they had their suspect, and they began building a case against him. The evidence was mostly circumstantial, but investigators were convinced they had found Christine's killer. In 1986, Guy Paul Morin was arrested and charged with the first-degree murder of Christine Jessup. The case against him included testimony from witnesses who claimed they had seen him acting suspiciously around the time of Christine's disappearance, forensic evidence that prosecutors argued linked him to the crime, and expert testimony about his behavior and psychological profile. The first trial ended in acquittal. The jury wasn't convinced by the prosecution's case and found Morin not guilty. But the Crown prosecutors were determined to get a conviction. They appealed the acquittal and won the right to retry Morin for the same crime. The second trial, held in 1992, had a very different outcome. This time, the prosecution presented additional forensic evidence, including hair and fiber analysis that they claimed definitively linked Morin to Christine's murder. The jury found him guilty, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 25 years. Guy Paul Morin had always maintained his innocence, but now he was facing the rest of his life in prison for a crime he insisted he didn't commit. His family and a small group of supporters continued to believe in his innocence and worked to find new evidence that might clear his name. The case began to unravel in the mid-1990s when DNA testing became more widely available and reliable. Morin's lawyers requested that biological evidence from the crime scene be tested using these new genetic techniques. The results were shocking. In 1995, DNA testing proved that Guy Paul Morin could not have committed the murder of Christine Jessup. The genetic material found on Christine's body didn't match Morin's DNA. After spending 10 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit, Morin was finally exonerated and released. The DNA results created a huge scandal in the Canadian legal system. How had an innocent man been convicted of such a serious crime? An inquiry was launched to examine what had gone wrong with the investigation and the prosecution. The inquiry found that police had focused too early on Morin as a suspect and had ignored evidence that might have pointed to other possibilities. The forensic evidence that had seemed so convincing at trial was flawed. Hair and fiber analysis, which seemed scientific and reliable, was actually much less precise than prosecutors had claimed. Most importantly, the real killer was still out there. The DNA evidence proved that someone else had murdered Christine Jessup, but investigators had no idea who that person might be. The genetic profile didn't match anyone in the criminal database, so the case remained unsolved despite the scientific breakthrough. For Christine's parents, Morin's exoneration was bittersweet. They were glad that an innocent man had been freed, but they still didn't know who had killed their daughter. The pain of losing Christine was compounded by the knowledge that her real killer had been free all this time. The case went cold again. Police had DNA evidence, but without a suspect to compare it to, the genetic profile was useless. Years passed with no new developments. The Jessup family had to live with the knowledge that Christine's killer was somewhere out there, possibly living a normal life while they continued to grieve. In 2007, police decided to take another look at the case using more advanced DNA techniques. They were able to develop a more complete genetic profile from the evidence, but it still didn't match anyone in the database. The investigation seemed to be at another dead end. The breakthrough finally came in 2020, more than 35 years after Christine's murder. Police decided to use genetic genealogy, the same technique that had solved the Golden State Killer case. They uploaded the unknown DNA profile to genealogy databases and began building family trees to identify possible suspects. The work was painstaking and took months to complete, but eventually, investigators narrowed their focus to one man, Calvin Hoover. He had lived in the Queensville area in 1984 and would have been 28 years old at the time of Christine's murder. Even more significantly, he was a neighbor and family friend of the Jessups. Calvin Hoover had been someone the family trusted. He had been around their house many times, knew Christine personally, and would have had easy access to information about the family's routines and schedules. He was exactly the kind of person who could have committed this crime without raising immediate suspicion. Police were excited to finally have a suspect, but when they went to arrest Calvin Hoover, they discovered something devastating. Hoover had died by suicide in 2015, 5 years before they identified him as Christine's killer. He had taken his secret to the grave. Further investigation confirmed that Hoover was indeed the killer. DNA from his family members provided additional confirmation that he was the source of the genetic material found at the crime scene. After 36 years, police finally knew who had murdered Christine Jessup, but justice would never be fully served. The revelation that Calvin Hoover was the killer was particularly painful for the Jessup family. This was someone they had known and trusted, someone who had been part of their community and had possibly even participated in the search for Christine. He had been hiding in plain sight all along while an innocent man went to prison for his crime. The case of Christine Jessup became one of the most important wrongful conviction cases in Canadian history. It led to major reforms in how forensic evidence is collected and analyzed, how police investigations are conducted, and how the justice system handles cases that rely heavily on circumstantial evidence. For Guy Paul Morin, the eventual identification of the real killer provided some additional vindication, but it couldn't give back the 10 years of his life that he lost in prison. His wrongful conviction had devastating effects on his mental health, his relationships, and his ability to live a normal life. The Christine Jessup case shows how dangerous it can be when investigators become too focused on a single suspect too early in an investigation. It also demonstrates how forensic evidence that seems reliable can be flawed or misinterpreted, leading to tragic consequences. Most importantly, it reminds us that justice delayed can become justice denied. While DNA technology eventually solved the case and exonerated an innocent man, the real killer was never held accountable for his crimes. Calvin Hoover lived with his secret for more than 30 years and died before he could face the consequences of what he had done. The case stands as a reminder of the importance of keeping an open mind during investigations, the need for rigorous scientific standards in forensic analysis, and the devastating human costs when the justice system gets it wrong. Christine Jessup deserved better, Guy Paul Morin deserved better, and their families deserved better than a system that took 36 years to find the truth. Case 4. The murder of Linda O'Keefe. July 6, 1973, was supposed to be just another summer day for 11-year-old Linda Ann O'Keefe in Newport Beach, California. School was out, the weather was perfect, and Linda had plans to spend the afternoon with friends. She had no way of knowing that this ordinary Friday would become one of the most haunting unsolved cases in Orange County history. Linda lived with her mother in a modest apartment complex not far from the beach. She was a typical 11-year-old who loved spending time with friends, riding her bike, and enjoying the freedom that summer vacation brought. Her mother worked during the day, so Linda often spent her afternoons exploring the neighborhood or visiting with other kids in the area. That morning, Linda had made plans to meet her friend at the Fun Zone, a popular amusement area on the Balboa Peninsula. The Fun Zone was a place where kids could play games, ride rides, and spend their allowance money on candy and souvenirs. For a kid growing up in Newport Beach in the 1970s, it was the perfect place to spend a summer afternoon. Linda left her apartment around noon, telling her mother she would be back by dinner time. She was wearing a white blouse and green shorts, and she had her long blonde hair in pigtails. She seemed happy and excited about her plans for the day. But Linda never made it to the Fun Zone. Sometime between leaving her apartment and reaching her destination, she disappeared. When she didn't come home that evening, her mother immediately called the police. Linda was a responsible child who always kept her word about when she would be home. The search for Linda began immediately. Newport Beach police officers canvassed the area where she was last seen, talking to residents and business owners to see if anyone had noticed her walking by. They also searched the route she would have taken to get to the Fun Zone, looking for any sign of what might have happened to her. The next morning, July 7th, Linda's body was found in a nature preserve area called Back Bay. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled. The discovery devastated her family and shocked the entire Newport Beach community. This was supposed to be a safe place where kids could walk around without fear, but someone had taken that safety away. Detective Jim Bowen was assigned to lead the investigation. He had worked child murder cases before, but Linda's case hit him particularly hard. She was just a little girl who had been excited about spending the day with her friend, and someone had stolen her life for no comprehensible reason. The crime scene investigation was thorough. Detectives collected every piece of potential evidence they could find, photographed the area extensively, and interviewed anyone who might have seen Linda on July 6th or noticed anything unusual in the Back Bay area. Several witnesses came forward with information that helped police piece together Linda's last hours. She had been seen walking along various streets in Newport Beach that afternoon, apparently heading toward the Fun Zone as planned. But somewhere along the way, someone had approached her and convinced her to go with them. The investigation expanded to include a review of similar crimes in the area and a careful examination of anyone who might have had contact with Linda. Detectives interviewed family members, neighbors, teachers, and anyone else who knew her, looking for someone who might have targeted her specifically. Police also canvassed the area looking for anyone who had been seen acting suspiciously on July 6th. They were particularly interested in finding anyone who might have been driving around the neighborhood or who had been seen talking to children in the area. The case generated significant media attention throughout Southern California. Linda's murder was the kind of crime that terrified parents and made entire communities more cautious about letting their children play outside unsupervised. Police received dozens of tips and potential leads, but none of them led to an arrest. As weeks turned into months, the investigation began to slow down. Police had collected biological evidence from the crime scene, but DNA testing didn't exist in 1973. The physical evidence was carefully preserved, but there was no way to use it to identify a suspect at that time. Detective Bowen continued working the case for years, following up on new tips when they came in, and periodically reviewing the evidence to see if anything had been missed. But without new information or technological advances, the case remained unsolved. Linda's mother never gave up hope that her daughter's killer would eventually be caught. She worked with police and advocacy groups to keep the case in the public eye, appearing at press conferences and speaking to reporters whenever there was renewed interest in the case. In the 1990s, when DNA testing became available, police had the biological evidence from Linda's case tested. The results confirmed that they had genetic material from her killer, but the DNA profile didn't match anyone in the criminal databases. Once again, the case seemed to hit a dead end. The years continued to pass. 2000, 2005, 2010. New detectives were assigned to the case as older investigators retired. Each new detective would review the file, hoping to spot something that had been missed, but the case remained cold. By 2018, Linda's case was 45 years old. Most of the original investigators had retired, and many of the witnesses from 1973 had died or moved away. The case seemed destined to remain forever unsolved, just another tragic cold case in a filing cabinet somewhere. But Detective Jennifer Manzella had a different idea. She was part of a new generation of investigators who understood how social media could be used to generate new interest in old cases. She proposed something that had never been tried before in a murder investigation. In July 2018, exactly 45 years after Linda's murder, the Newport Beach Police Department launched an unusual Twitter campaign. They created an account that tweeted as if Linda herself was telling the story of her last day alive. The tweets were written in the first person, describing her plans, her excitement about meeting her friend, and her journey through Newport Beach on July 6, 1973. The Twitter campaign was unlike anything law enforcement had done before. Tweet by tweet, hour by hour, Linda's story unfolded in real time, 45 years after it had actually happened. The account described her morning routine, her conversation with her mother, her walk through the neighborhood, and eventually, the moment when something went wrong. The campaign was carefully planned to be respectful, while still generating maximum attention. The tweets were written from Linda's perspective, but they focused on the investigation and the search for her killer rather than the graphic details of her murder. The response was overwhelming. The Twitter campaign went viral, with thousands of people sharing Linda's story and expressing their support for finding her killer. News outlets across the country picked up the story, generating more publicity for the case than it had received in decades. More importantly, the renewed attention generated new tips and leads. People who had been in Newport Beach in 1973 came forward with information they had never shared before. Some had been children themselves at the time and hadn't realized the importance of what they had seen. Others had been afraid to get involved but now felt compelled to help. While the Twitter campaign was generating public attention, Detective Manzella was also working with DNA specialists to see if new genetic genealogy techniques could help solve the case. The same methods that had been used to catch the Golden State Killer were now being applied to Linda's case. Investigators uploaded the killer's DNA profile to genealogy databases and began the painstaking process of building family trees to identify potential suspects. The work took months and required collaboration between detectives, genetic genealogists, and genealogy researchers. Eventually, the family tree research led investigators to James Allen Neal, a 72-year-old man living quietly in Monument, Colorado. Neal was the right age to have committed the crime in 1973, and his family background matched the genetic evidence from the case. When investigators looked into Neil's history, they discovered that he had been living in Southern California in 1973 and had connections to the Newport Beach area. He fit the general description that witnesses had provided, and he had no solid alibi for July 6, 1973. Police obtained a DNA sample from Neil and compared it to the evidence from Linda's case. The results confirmed what they had suspected. James Allen Neil was Linda O'Keefe's killer. On February 19, 2019, James Allen Neil was arrested at his home in Colorado. He had been living there for years with his family, working as a computer technician and living what appeared to be a completely normal suburban life. His neighbors knew him as a quiet, helpful man who kept to himself but was always willing to lend a hand when needed. The arrest shocked everyone who knew Neil, his family, his neighbors, his co-workers. None of them had any idea that he was connected to a 45-year-old murder case. He had been hiding in plain sight for decades, raising his own children while keeping the secret of what he had done to Linda O'Keefe. Neil eventually pleaded guilty to Linda's murder and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During his sentencing hearing, Linda's family finally got the chance to speak directly to the man who had killed her. They described how his actions had affected their lives and how they had never stopped hoping for justice. The case became a landmark example of how modern investigative techniques could be combined with innovative public outreach to solve decades-old crimes. The Twitter campaign had generated unprecedented public interest, while genetic genealogy had provided the scientific breakthrough needed to identify the killer. Detective Manzella's creative approach to the case inspired other law enforcement agencies to think differently about how they could use social media to generate new leads in cold cases. The idea of giving victims a voice through social media platforms became a new tool in the investigators' toolkit. For Linda's family, Neil's arrest and conviction provided the closure they had been seeking for 45 years. They finally knew who had killed Linda and why. More importantly, they knew that he would never hurt another child. The case also demonstrated how someone could live a double life for decades. James Allen Neil had appeared to be a normal family man, but he had been carrying the secret of a child's murder for his entire adult life. His ability to maintain this facade for so long was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire case. Linda O'Keefe's case proved that combining traditional detective work with modern technology and creative public outreach could solve even the oldest and most challenging cases. It also showed that justice, no matter how long delayed, could still be achieved. Most importantly, it gave Linda O'Keefe a voice again. For 45 years, her story had been told only in police reports and newspaper articles. The Twitter campaign allowed her to tell her own story, in her own words, and to help catch the man who had taken her life. In a way, Linda O'Keefe had solved her own murder. Case 5. The BTK Killer. The most dangerous man in Wichita, Kansas, was also the most ordinary. He went to work every day, coached his daughter's softball team, served as president of his church council, and helped his elderly neighbors with yard work. Everyone who knew Dennis Rader thought he was boring, maybe a little strict, but certainly not dangerous. They had no idea he was one of America's most sadistic serial killers. January 15, 1974, was when the terror began. The Otero family was getting ready for what should have been a normal Tuesday morning in their quiet Wichita neighborhood. Joseph Otero was preparing for work while his wife Julie was getting their two youngest children ready for school. Their older children had already left the house, not knowing they would never see their family alive again. Someone knocked on the front door that morning. When Joseph Otero answered it, he found a man who claimed to have car trouble and needed to use the phone. It seemed like a reasonable request from a neighbor who needed help. Joseph let the stranger into his house, and that act of kindness cost him his life and the lives of his family. The man who entered the Otero house that day was Dennis Rader, though police wouldn't know his name for more than 30 years. He had been watching the family, learning their routines and waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. He came prepared with rope, tape, and a plan that he had been fantasizing about for months. What happened next was so brutal that even experienced homicide detectives were shaken by the crime scene. Joseph and Julie Otero were bound and strangled. Their 11-year-old daughter Josephine was hanged in the basement. Their 9-year-old son Joseph Jr. was found in his bedroom, also strangled. The killer had methodically murdered an entire family for no apparent reason other than his own twisted satisfaction. The Wichita Police Department had never seen anything like this. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong or a domestic dispute that had escalated. This was the calculated work of someone who enjoyed killing and had planned every detail of the attack. Detective Bernie Drawatsky, who worked the scene, knew immediately that they were dealing with a different kind of killer. The investigation into the Otero murders consumed the police department. Detectives interviewed hundreds of people, followed up on thousands of tips, and checked every possible lead. But the killer had been careful not to leave obvious evidence behind, and there seemed to be no connection between him and the Otero family. 3 months later, the killer struck again. Catherine Bright was a 21-year-old woman who lived alone in a small house in Wichita. On April 4, 1974, she came home from work to find an intruder waiting for her. Her brother Kevin had decided to visit her that day and arrived during the attack. He tried to save his sister but was shot by the killer and left for dead. Kevin survived, but Catherine did not. Kevin Bright's description of the attacker gave police their first real lead. The killer was a white male, probably in his 20s or 30s, average height and build. But that description could have fit thousands of men in Wichita. Without more specific details, the investigation continued to struggle. The attack stopped after Catherine Bright's murder, and for a while, it seemed like maybe the killer had moved away or been arrested for something else. But in October 1974, a letter arrived at the Wichita Eagle newspaper that changed everything. The letter was typed and contained details about the Otero murders that only the killer could have known. It also contained a chilling signature. The writer identified himself as BTK, which stood for Bind, Torture, Kill. He described his crimes in cold clinical language and made it clear that he planned to kill again. This was the beginning of a twisted relationship between BTK and the media that would continue for decades. He seemed to enjoy the attention his crimes generated and wanted to make sure he got credit for his work. The letter proved that the Otero and Bright murders were connected and that Wichita had a serial killer. BTK struck again in 1977, killing Shirley Vian in her home while her children were present. He forced the children into a bathroom and told them to stay there while he killed their mother. The cruelty of involving children in his crimes showed just how depraved he had become. Later that same year, BTK killed Nancy Fox in her apartment. After murdering her, he called the police from a payphone to report the crime, calmly telling the dispatcher where they could find the body. He seemed to enjoy the power he had over the entire city. Between 1974 and 1991, BTK killed 10 people in the Wichita area. His victims included families, single women, and even children. There was no pattern to who he targeted except that they were all vulnerable and accessible. He studied his victims, learned their routines, and struck when they were most defenseless. Throughout this period, BTK continued to communicate with police and the media. He sent letters, poems, and even drawings describing his crimes. He created his own logo and seemed to view his murders as a kind of brand that he was building. The communications gave investigators insights into his personality, but never provided enough information to identify him. The most frustrating thing for police was that BTK seemed to disappear between attacks. He would commit a horrific murder, send a few letters, and then go quiet for months or even years. During these quiet periods, he appeared to be living a completely normal life somewhere in Wichita. After 1991, BTK went completely silent. There were no more murders, no more letters, no more communications of any kind. Police wondered if he had died, moved away, or been imprisoned for another crime. Some investigators hoped he was dead, because that would mean the killing had stopped permanently. The silence continued through the 1990s and into the 2000s. A new generation of detectives took over the case, reviewing old evidence with fresh eyes and hoping that new technology might provide breakthrough. DNA testing had become available, and investigators were able to develop a genetic profile of BTK from evidence left at crime scenes. But it didn't match anyone in the criminal databases. In 2004, 30 years after the first BTK murder, something unexpected happened. The Wichita Eagle received a letter that contained a photocopy of the driver's license of one of BTK's victims. The killer was communicating again after 13 years of silence. Lieutenant Ken Landwehr, who is now leading the BTK investigation, realized that the killer's need for attention had brought him out of hiding. BTK couldn't resist the opportunity to remind everyone that he was still out there and that his crimes had never been solved. Over the next several months, BTK sent a series of communications to police and the media. He sent packages containing jewelry and identification cards taken from his victims. He sent a cereal box containing a doll that he had bound and tortured to represent one of his victims. Each communication was designed to prove that he was the real BTK and to generate media attention. Lieutenant Lanthere decided to use BTK's need for attention against him. Instead of keeping the communications secret, police released some of them to the media, ensuring that BTK got the publicity he craved. They hoped this would encourage him to keep communicating and eventually make a mistake. The strategy worked better than anyone expected. BTK became increasingly bold in his communications, sending longer letters and more detailed descriptions of his crimes. He seemed to be enjoying the game he was playing with police and the attention he was getting from the media. In February 2005, BTK made the mistake that would finally bring him down. He sent police a floppy disk, asking in a previous letter whether a floppy disk could be traced back to him. Police had responded through a newspaper ad, telling him that floppy disks could not be traced. This was a lie, but BTK believed it. When investigators examined the floppy disk, they found deleted files that contained metadata showing the disk had been used on a computer at Christ Lutheran Church in Wichita. One of the deleted files was a document that had been created by someone named Dennis. A simple internet search revealed that Dennis Rader was the president of the church council at Christ Lutheran Church. When investigators looked into Rader's background, they found that he fit the profile of BTK perfectly. He was the right age, had lived in Wichita during all the murders, and worked as a compliance officer for the city, which gave him access to information about residents and their homes. On February 25, 2005, Dennis Rader was arrested outside his home in Park City, a suburb of Wichita. His neighbors were shocked. The man they had known for years as a helpful, if somewhat rigid, neighbor was actually the BTK killer who had terrorized their city for decades. Rader's double life was almost impossible to believe. During the day, he worked for the city, enforcing municipal codes and regulations. He was known for being strict and by the book, someone who would write citations for tall grass or improper trash disposal. In the evenings and weekends, he was active in his church, serving in leadership positions and helping with community events. His family had no idea about his secret life. His wife Paula had been married to him for more than 30 years. His daughter Carrie was a teacher, and his son Brian was serving in the military. They knew Dennis as a father and husband who was maybe a little controlling and obsessive about rules, but certainly not violent. When confronted with the evidence against him, Dennis Rader confessed to all 10 BTK murders. During his confession, he described his crimes in the same cold, clinical language he had used in his letters. He showed no remorse for his victims and seemed more concerned about getting the details right than about the pain he had caused. The confession revealed the true extent of Rader's double life. He had been living as BTK in his fantasies while maintaining a facade of normalcy in his everyday life. He had been planning murders while sitting in church meetings. He had been binding and torturing victims in his mind while coaching Little League baseball. Rader was sentenced to 10 consecutive life sentences, one for each of his victims. During the sentencing hearing, family members of his victims were allowed to speak directly to him. Many of them expressed not just anger about the murders, but bewilderment about how someone could live such a complete lie for so many years. The BTK case became a study in how serial killers can hide in plain sight. Dennis Rader wasn't a loner living on the margins of society. He was fully integrated into his community, with a job, a family, and social connections. His ability to maintain this double life for more than 30 years was perhaps as disturbing as the murders themselves. The case also showed how a killer's own ego could lead to their downfall. If Dennis Rader had remained silent after 1991, he might never have been caught. But his need for attention and recognition was so strong that he couldn't resist reaching out to police and the media, even though he knew it was dangerous. And now we have come to the end of today's documentary. If you like us to do more chilling documentaries like this video and leave a comment below. You can also check out the next video on your screen. See you in the next video.